According to Wikipedia, I may be standing in the middle of a colonial garbage dump. Nice work if you can get it. So I'm outside Park Street Station on the red and green subway lines in Boston, which means I must be on Boston Common at the corner. So yeah, here's what we're going to talk about today. A little bit of Boston Common history. Boston Common is 50 acres or 20 hectares of public land. It is, in theory, the oldest public park in the United States. Some people claim that it's the oldest public park in the world due to the time when it was actually opened up formally to public usage. There was also a time early in the colony's history when this was cow pasture for several families. Walking away from the subway stations behind me. Of course, Boston Subway was one of the first in the world and in the United States. And those stations were among the first on the line as a whole because the first section of route that was open for the subway went from Park Street Station at this corner of Boston Common down to Boylston Street at one of the other corners of the common. Behind me is the Park Street Church. When I was a kid, I used to think that was the Paul Revere Church, one if by land, two if by sea, but it's not. It's different. If I turn you around, that's the Massachusetts State House behind me with its gold leaf dome. At 50 acres in size, Boston Common is over half the size of California Disneyland. Unlike Disneyland, most of Boston Common is just walkways and open grass and trees. But there are several buildings and other structures, and we'll go visit a few of them today. So the part of Boston Common you see behind me is known as the Frog Pond, and in summer, there will actually be sprinkler systems set out here so that kids and people can cool off in the mist that's made by the sprinklers. But as you can see behind me right now, there's a skating rink, and that's normal for this time of year. It's midwinter. Although we're having an unseasonably warm day right now, it's about 10 degrees Celsius or 50 degrees Fahrenheit for us Yanks. And you can see there are people out skating. There's also a lot of moisture on the surface of the ice because it's melting. I've never skated here. Skating and I don't get along that well, but it looks like a lot of fun for people who are into it. And yes, there are in fact frogs at the frog pond. In fact, this guy looks like he's got a bait bucket and a rod and reel, which leads me to the question, what exactly do frogs fish for? Here's a Civil War monument. So here's a couple of my favorite weird facts about Boston Common. I think everybody knows the story of how it was originally cow pasture. Apparently it wasn't cow pasture for very long, simply because the population of the settlement was growing fast enough and the demand for cow pasturage was significant enough that they really couldn't put everything right here. In fact, if you're aware of the idea of the tragedy of the commons, where shared land gets overused because nobody in particular feels as though it's their responsibility to take care of it, that apparently happened here in the early days for a while. Now that's all pretty well-known stuff, but when I've looked at maps of Boston in the pre-revolutionary days, in the colonial era, and even somewhat afterward, one of the things that used to get noted on maps of the area just behind me is the presence of things called rope walks. And I always wondered, what's a rope walk? Well, it's actually very simple. If you're constructing rope out of long fibers or long materials, you have to have a way of laying them out in a line so that you can then twist them together. And rope walks were things laid out in the open air or under various kinds of sheds, where people would go ahead and slowly braid those rope fibers together. And what you have to remember, of course, is that these are folks in the pre-steam age, pre-industrial revolution, pre what we think of as ordinary low-tech technology now. And of course, this was also a major shipping port. So they were building boats and they were providing sails, and they had to have some way of rigging those sails, and they would make rope. The other thing that I find interesting about this area, behind me that is that just behind that structure that you can see over my shoulder is a street called Charles Street, named after the river which flows through the city, although the river itself may be named for some other Charles, probably one of the kings of England at that time. But the area that Charles Street occupies right now used to be the shoreline of this peninsula that Boston is located on. All of that land behind, where you see some of those buildings behind me, that was filled in mostly in the 19th century. But behind that, the Back Bay area really was a bay in the river at that point. So the area of grass that you can see down there, over the ridge of the hill, apparently was a midden. Apparently it was a place where everybody dumped all their garbage, because being on the shore of the bay, the area was actually a salt marsh and wasn't good for anything other than, well, if it was good for something, they didn't think about it, so they dumped their trash there. So here we are at, or even slightly over, what would have been the shoreline of the Back Bay of the Charles River in the colonial days. This structure behind me isn't anything impressive or historically important at all, unless you talk about personal history and the way we all have our childhood memories. This is an entrance to a parking lot that is underground under my feet. When my dad used to come downtown on business when I was a kid, he would sometimes park here. I just thought it was the coolest thing that you had a car park under a public park. Go figure. When you get older, you realize that things like that aren't all that uncommon, but here it is. It's a picture-perfect day. In fact, this is the kind of day that Boston is really wonderful for in the spring. It's a little funny to be having it in January, but I'll take it. It's cool, but sunny. It's warm, but not oppressively humid or hot. And really, weather like this is Boston at its best. There's stairs up to this little rotunda here. Let's see what we find out if we go up. Something I always notice about Boston Common when I'm here is that because the land slopes upward to Beacon Hill, and because there's a hill in the middle of the park itself, there are a lot of different zones. And so you could be in one part of the park and not really have a view of other parts of the park. And so in some ways it feels bigger than it actually is. Not that it's small, but it's segmented in a way that gives you a different feel for where you are and what's going on at different parts of the walk that you make through it. It's nice. Literally just a walk in the park. If you like this video, hit the subscribe button so you can easily find other videos in the series. And if you just happen to be madly in love with me, hit the notification bell so YouTube will update you as I upload new content.